I decided I'm going to carry everything in back issues. Had to have all the gold keys, I had to have all the Dells I can get my hands on, all the Harveys, all the Archies, all the everything. And I think that's the reason I'm still around today, is I didn't put everything into Marvel and DC only, which pretty much everybody else did, pretty much all my competitors. A lot of them just didn't last very long. And you'd be amazed the money people will spend on back issues, Archies and Harveys and stuff when they find a dealer who actually has them. It's incredibly hard to put together. For example, Archie's Girls Betting Veronica set. Where would you go for that? You go to the average dealer, they might have 3 or 10 to pick from. On a normal week, out of 347 issues, I would probably have 300 of them in stock.
Let's talk about Star Wars #1.
Oh yeah.
The first printing.
There's a good one.
Is that a book that you knew was going to sell out? You have to wait till the movie come out? Did #1 sit there for a month and then become hot?
It took the movie for it to take off. The book came out and it was kind of a non-event. I was carrying a little bit of science fiction book at the time, and it was a non-event, the book. I remember after the movie taken off that people realized that the book came out almost a year, I don't know, was it 6 months or a year before the comic and the movie. So the book is actually a pretty good item that's really underrated. It's the Darth Vader cover. It's like a painted cover. As opposed to the later cover that had like the gold cover. So that had come out, nobody cared. Suddenly the movie hit the theaters and everybody had to have Star Wars. We were selling tons of copies of all the reprints and the treasuries and the digests and everything that came out with Star Wars on it. I carried every magazine I could get my hands on from Canadian News that had Star Wars in it. Of course, everything, Buck Rogers movie was coming out, and the Superman movie was coming out, and all that stuff was coming out. All this, it seemed like in the same period.
Did it seem to boost the whole economy in a sense? Did it make
Well, you know what
impact?
the strange thing was, I would say Star Wars #1 might have almost saved the comic industry, because there was an implosion. A lot of people have forgotten about comics. Actually, let's back up a little bit, and then we'll get to that. What had happened is that, trying to remember the year, I think it was the late 50s, Atlas, before it became Marvel, had a distributor that I believe went under, and somehow the distribution of Marvel Comics was left to the people who distributed DC. And that went on until I think 1968, and DC was, or Marvel was restricted, I think it was 16 titles a month, which was why a lot of things were bi-monthly or even quarterly or whatever. So if you wanted to have that Billy the Model come out, you'd have to sacrifice Tales of Suspense or something like that. And they had that restriction, I believe it was till 1968, and I think the number was 16 comics in 1 month. Because DC was distributing Marvel is basically what it came down to. Then Curtis came along in 1968, and that's what kind of changed everything. Up to that point, the print runs were pretty high in a lot of Silver Age Marvels and DCs. I don't know, maybe 4, 5, 600,000. I think the Batman during the movie craze might have hit 800,000 or more. The strange thing is, people don't realize Archie was usually better selling than most of the superheroes in that period. But anyway, when Curtis came along and started distributing Marvel, that was Marvel's distributor, all of a sudden there was no restriction to how many books they could put on the newsstand. That's why all of a sudden Suspense and Astonish split into 2 books out of each, so you had 4 books instead of 2. Those titles were cancelled. Surfer #1's coming out, Iron Man #1's coming out, all this stuff's coming out. Give it a couple more years, they started experimenting with, you know, Conan and all these reprint books like, you know, Beware and Where Monsters Dwell and all this stuff. And That's why the explosion of comics on the newsstands in that late Silver Age, early Bronze Age period. All of a sudden we had probably 4 times as many titles in the stands. What it did is it diluted the print runs. Instead of having 400,000 and 600,000 print runs, suddenly you'd have 250,000, 300,000 print runs of these things. And it was a competition between Marvel and DC to fill the stands. So all of a sudden you had reprint titles, and eventually stuff like the Treasuries came out, and they tried the magazines, and they were just filling the stands with anything they could print for a while there. What they did to themselves, though, is they diluted the print runs. The backlash came in around 1977 when there was that big implosion. Well, the first thing to go was actually in 76, I guess, when Atlas Seaboard folded, because they had come along into the market with, how many titles did they have, like 25 or 30 titles or whatever it was. And they lasted not even a year, so they imploded first. And Marvel and DC were still pumping out the number ones like crazy, because that's where the money was. And all of a sudden the print runs were starting to crash. Titles were getting cancelled left and right. We had the cancelled Comic Cavalite came, where they printed a lot of the comics that didn't get printed for DC. Basically the comic industry was imploding around 1977-ish. All of a sudden Star Wars came along, one of the best-selling comics of all time, and then they started experimenting with other stuff. Hey, let's try more licensed stuff. Then they brought, Shogun Warriors and ROM and Transformers was later, but all these titles were coming along, and hey, we could make money on this stuff, and we can make multiple printings and reprints even. That was a bit of a turning point, and by coincidence, that was the same year that Phil Suling got his idea. Phil Suling was Seagate Distribution out of New York, and I had been reading about this in the Buyer's Guide, the Buyer's Guide to take over by mid-70s, and Rocket's Blast was on the way out. But so I was reading about Phil Suling Distribution, and the deal was, instead of getting 30% off, and with return privileges, you would get 40 to 50% off depending on the quantity you bought, but they were not returnable. And then they had started marking them differently. They put the diamond box or the without the UPC, or it would be white or whatever, and that way they could tell you can't return it. Eh? That started in 1977, so of course I had to get in on that immediately. So I was ordering from Seagate as soon as I can get my little paws out there and get it moving. So in 1977 I started getting the direct comics. When the direct copies came out, they came about 3 weeks before the newsstand copies hit out here. I guess because they were so, just the whole logistics of it. By the time they got it on the truck and unloaded and distributed and all that, it was about 3-week lag. So I was the first to have everything in the city always. Nobody wanted to wait 3 weeks, so that made the explosion in Winnipeg really take off. Just in the year when everything was imploding. So the direct market and the fact that the licensing with Star Wars and everything else was coming along kind of at the same time was the first thing to really resurrect the comic industry. At that time, there was other things that were going on. When it first came out, we had the new X-Men come back. At that point in time, X-Men was one of the worst selling comics. They had that spout with reprints, and they weren't that popular as an original team. They only became popular later because of the new X-Men. So when it first came out, it was not that big a deal. About a year later, it's when it started to take off. So all that was taking off at the same time. Then John Byrne came along, and the X-Men went through the roof. This was all happening at the same time. So being the only place in town that had the direct copies was great for a long period of time. I could order unlimited quantities of things because I was ordering 2 months in advance. So those were kind of a heyday for me in a time period when the industry was imploding. I remember going to a convention, let's see, where was it? Was it Chicago? I think it was Chicago. And they had a meeting of the comic dealers. At the time, this might have been later, I can't remember the exact year, but anyway, the direct system was in its very early stages, and Jim Shooter was in charge. And he basically, no, this is the one reason, even though I liked his comics, this is the one thing that turned me off for the rest of the time I've been in comics, is that he was very insulting to the early dealers. He actually said, "You guys are a pain in the ass. We have to make these direct copies and all this, and here we're there to make all these deals to get direct comics going." Of course, later he retracted all that, you know, which was it was a silly thing. I guess it was the timing and everybody bothering him, but at the time it was an irritating thing because we were looked at as a pain in the ass, basically. But basically, the direct copies saved the entire industry, I would say, from extinction, because newsstand comics just weren't selling like they used to. Everybody was buying collectible comics only, and they didn't want the regular comics. So that's why we saw a lot of the genres dying. The horror was dying, and the western was dying, and the cartoon was dying, and all the other genres were all slowly dying, and everything was becoming superhero because the whole market was becoming direct. It took about a decade for the direct to completely overtake the newsstand copies. By the late 80s, the newsstand copies are the scarce ones, and the direct copies are the common ones. That's important in one way, is that in Canada anyway, is from 82 to 86 for Marvel and 82 to 88 for DC. The newsstand copies, they had Canadian newsstand copies with the higher cover price. They had small print runs, and they're now among the most collected comics. They're the new variant that everybody's starting to pick up on. If you check out the prices on eBay, you'll see that most of the key issues sell for about 50% more to double what the direct edition does. And that I've been saying that for about 10 years in my market reports. Of course, nobody listens until the prices start happening. Now they're starting to listen, eh? So that was an interesting thing that came out of all that.
When those comics were brand new, and you had more than one version, did you have anyone back then who did care about which version they had? Were there anybody who said, "I must have both"?
Well, what had happened is, at that time we had a couple of competitors in town. One of the ones I recall was actually an ex-customer who had a store called Back Alley Books, and he had stopped becoming a customer and became a dealer, and he had decided that the direct editions were reprints. So he's trying to tell everybody that the direct editions are reprints. You shouldn't be buying them. You should buy older real copies that he was getting from Canadian News. And he did that for quite a few years. I would say, I don't know, at least 5 years, maybe 7 years. He carried only newsstand copies, and I had my direct ones, but basically people didn't fall for it after a while because they kept saying, "I don't want to wait 3 weeks extra for the newsstand copies to come out when I can get it immediately as the direct copy." And then they started making direct only stuff. Well, what is he going to do about that? You know, so.
Did the Canadian News itself have competition, or did they have all of Winnipeg?
Canadian News actually, yeah, they had all of Winnipeg. There was basically only one distributor for pretty much all the magazines, all the comics, maybe even the paperbacks. There was basically the one place to go, and like I said, back in those days, the newsstand stuff, the idea was if it didn't sell, you could return it, and they would strip the cover off and get the money back. Eh? That idea, of course, it had worked for half a century, but in comics, where they only sold if they were collectible and they weren't selling to the general public anymore, that had changed the industry at that point in time. It's strange that that was happening here in North America when a lot of the places in the rest of the world had changed it around, like in Europe and Japan. Like in Europe in particular, the Disney comics were becoming huge. They were becoming a household thing. Like in Italy, pretty much everybody bought the Disney comics. In Japan, the manga comics, they're delivered like newspapers. There was a point in time that probably one every 4 or one every 6 people in Japan was buying a comic. Meanwhile, in North America, who's supposedly the creator of this media, everything was going down because it was all becoming only collectible. If it's not collectible, it wasn't something to read anymore, which is bizarre. That the market had changed that bad, and it's kind of continued that way. Comics today are mainly printed for collectors. They're not aimed at the young kids like they used to be. It's hard to get the ground floor people going. Luckily, the movies are getting kids interested in comics again, and now that the people who were collectors in the 70s and 80s are growing older, they're trying to get their kids interested again. So it's helping. We've left it a little bit late. I think they should not have let the newsstand sales market die so much. They should have somehow encouraged it. Maybe have, like I always kind of like the digest idea where you could buy reprints and get, say, 192 pages for $2 or whatever. I always thought that was a good idea. I would like to see something like that for the Marvel and DC comics to introduce kids, like in the grocery stores, and just to get them into the industry again. Eh?
How often did you advertise in the Buyer's Guide, and were you also advertising anywhere else in the late 70s, early 80s?
I was advertising in the Buyer's Guide all the way through the 70s. I tried a couple other fanzines. They didn't work out very well. It wasn't until the 80s that I started to advertise in Marvel Comics. I had other places also too. But the Buyer's Guide basically was it through the 70s. And one of the things I actually did at that time period is I had met Richard Comley, Captain Canuck, and one of the first things that happened was he had shown me this art for this projected character, and here he had Captain Canuck's. If you look at the inside the first issue on the first page, he had him in like pajamas. They were making a pajamas joke. That was going to be the cover of Captain Canuck #1. So he had asked my opinion. I said, that's a terrible cover. If you're going to have a Canadian character, it should be on the cover with a flag and look like a superhero. Eh? So he had actually changed that cover and moved it to the inside. But anyways, at the time, because I was heavy into the local market and the mail order market, he gave me exclusive distribution for selling to the States, I guess you would say. I would buy like 2,000 copies of every issue, and I would advertise in the Buyer's Guide, and I was the only place to get them basically for all 14 issues and the special. Eh? So I'm the one that got most of those copies in the United States, to the United States, and that was through the Buyer's Guide. I'm not even sure if Seagate carried them or not. If he did, they didn't sell that well that way. So I had known Comley for all these years, and I still talk to him today.
Cool. What was your personal interest in comics by the late 70s? Are you still reading? Are you too busy?
I was still reading comics. I was probably still reading comics until about the early 1980s when I started to slow down. I had gotten married in '82, got a little bit married, involved in family life and a little bit of travel and stuff like that for a while. My first one didn't work out, so I got remarried again in '87 with my current wife, and that has worked out great. She's been very supportive with everything. But what happened is I got so busy. I had a store in Calgary, and I was doing mail order, and I had stores in Winnipeg, and everything was so busy, and I had family life on top of that, that I basically didn't have time for comics or even watching TV or anything like that. so I kind of dropped off the reading for quite a long time. Nowadays I just read the odd one here and there. When you do comics, 60, 70, 80 hours a week work, by the time the end of the day comes, you kind of don't want to do any more of it, eh? I do a quick course, I still occasionally read some. More into books and movies, and I like the TV shows and complete seasons on DVD, stuff like that these days, eh?
Mm-hmm. How big was the comic market in Winnipeg in the late 70s in terms of other stores, competition, conventions?
Winnipeg was a real hub for comic collectors, which is kind of amazing because, I mean, it's what, I don't know, what, the 6th or 7th biggest city or something like that. I think it's maybe because we had several major dealers, whereas most of the other provinces only had 1 or 2. There was, I guess Ken Mitchell was one of the original dealers in Winnipeg. He was around from the early 60s till, I guess, the late 70s, and then I believe he moved to Toronto. He was specialized mostly in Golden Age, but with a smattering of Silver Age. And then there was Kelvin Sabodian, basically selling from about the mid-60s also. And he was in Winnipeg, and then he was in Brandon and Rivers and different places in Manitoba. And he eventually moved out to, I believe it's Calgary he's in now. He's still around, he still sells a little bit on eBay. There's Joe Krolick, he's still around today. He used to call his store Sticks, now he calls it Comics America. He's heavy into new comics, although he does have a lot of back issues. He's the one who hasn't done as much mail order, so he's probably not too well known outside of Manitoba other than for new comic subscriptions, although he does have a website. And then there's me, who has been selling comics by mail order since '71, still doing it today.
Tell me about the growth of the Overstreet price guide and the whole interest in gold and silver age prices just increasing like crazy by the late 70s.
Oh, for sure. Everybody figured the market was always going to be for Golden Age. Strangely enough, when it was in the 1960s, the most desirable comics were not superhero comics. They were stuff like Famous Funnies 1, Ace #1, Tarzan Single Series number 20 was considered one of the biggest books, if not the biggest book. The feature book, Prince Valiants, that type of stuff. The reprint books, basically from the 30s, were considered the big books. I remember.
And who do you think established that?
I think it was these dealers who'd been around as late as early as the late 50s. People like Claude Held, for example. I remember seeing a 1958 catalog where he had Superman #1 and Marvel Mystery, or not Marvel Mystery, Mystery in Space #1, priced for around the same price. I think they're about $5. And then the reprint books, some of them were as high as $10. So people had decided that the comic strip books were the most valuable for actually quite a period of time, eh?
Do you think it has anything to do with, like Classics Illustrated, just the whole supposed more seriousness of a book made
Yeah,
it
well,
potentially more valuable?
The comic strip art, I guess, was taken more seriously for a while, at least in that period. Let's face it, it's hard to top, Prince Valiant and Flash Gordon. They were just amazing books. Unfortunately, the interest for that, a lot of the Golden Age characters that have kind of disappeared has been waning, and the whole industry is kind of shifting toward basically the superhero age, the Marvel age, Silver Age, DC's and up.
Do you think it's the public, or is it the companies kind of streamlining that has made this basically a superhero only business?
Well, actually, it goes back to what we were talking about in 1977 when the direct started, and the direct market catered to the collectors and what the collectors collect. The main thing was the superhero books, so that's why we saw so many of the other genres die for so many years, some of them almost into extinction. And then thankfully by the 80s, the direct market came along with some independent publishers being able to resurrect a lot of these titles, and they could do it with small print runs. And that kind of brought back a lot of those things that were disappearing off the market, which is actually great.
If superheroes continue their dominance in the future and basically all the other formats, Western, romance, etc., die off, do you see that being bad, that in the future there just won't be enough collectors to support high prices for, you know, like Westerns, for example, have been falling in value in OVERSTREET for years. Not necessarily just because there's less demand, but also because they were just too high in the first place.
Yeah. Well, they're not really so much falling in prices. Everything else is going up, and they're not doing as well. The crowd for the Western comics, I guess, is the average age of the collector has been going up and up and up, whereas the superhero comics are interest basically to all ages, because they're seeing all these superhero movies and toys. And let's face it, now that Disney has bought both Marvel and Star Wars, they're going to be bombarding us with that stuff. Yeah, it's going to be overshadowing all these other genres. It's really sad, because you know, entire generations are not going to see stuff like Carl Barks and the classic Little Lulus and the Spirit comics and all these, you know, even ECs. People are just not going to pay attention to these anymore if the superheroes continue the dominance.
So do you believe then that the future of comics will rely completely on what movies are put out?
At this point in time, it seems to be where the direction is. But if you look back and realize how many comic movies that kind of go under the radar, a lot of them are actually from graphic novels, which I think is the future. I think graphic novels, often people don't want to buy the single issues, which is why graphic novels has taken off so much, or collecting, you know, instead of 4 different stories or 10 different issues, you buy it all in one book. It's kind of like buying a TV season. You don't want to miss something, you want to get the whole story. So graphic novels and these collections have really taken off. In fact, I think, I don't know, what are they, 25 or 35% of the entire industry these days, something like that. They're getting into places where comics don't normally get, you know, into the chain stores and that. So that's actually a very good sign. I would like to see that market grow even more, and maybe that's how we're going to expand the genre of comics into the rest of the world. There's a lot of movies being made out of these things. Sometimes you don't even realize that some of these movies were made from comics. Sometimes they don't advertise that fact. Maybe they should promote it more.
Switching topics a bit, back to the 70s, it was common comics would be gathered up and sold in bag sets. Is that something you carried, you could get through the distributors? Where did those turn up?
Well, the bag comics actually go back quite a ways, and into the 60s at least. The first ones I recall was those, well, King Comics had some bag sets for a while there. That's why, for example, Phantom number 22 is ultra common, and Mandrake number 5 is ultra common. They came 3 in a pack, so those are really common for the King Comics. I don't know if the reason for that particularly, I'm assuming maybe they overprinted those 3 issues, and so they tried throwing in the pack, and maybe it didn't sell that well. And then there was the Tops, was it Tops Comics? Anyway, it was the reprints of the Gold Keys that came out in the mid-60s, was it 66 or 7, I think, where they had done, you know, 1 to 4 each of a bunch of titles. That was a kind of a bag experiment. I think those did fairly well, because there seems to be enough copies around floating the market. Not that easy to get put together as a set, but some people are interested. I think the first successful ones are probably the Whitman ones, which were basically Whitman editions of Gold Key comics, which started in '72, and those are the same places you'd find like coloring books, so it'd be in chain stores and stuff. So that did pretty well. Went on to around 1980, and the interesting part about all that is in August 1980 through December 1980, you couldn't buy a Gold Key comic anymore. They had become Whitman, And for that period, August through December of 1980, the only way to get those comics was in a bag. And you could not get them from an independent distributor. I couldn't get mine from Canadian News, for example. I had to actually go pay full retail for them in the chain stores. I found the best place in Winnipeg to get them was the Bay. So I always went to Bay. Being a Disney collector, I had to have all those Disney comics. I had to find, get my Scrooge 179 that way. So all of a
Do we
sudden,
know why they weren't available?
I guess Gold Key was failing, and Whitman had. See, Gold Key, Golden, Gold Key, Whitman, they're all the same company basically with different divisions. They have coloring books, they have hardcover books, they have all kinds of things and different ways to distribute them. But mostly they were put in like bookstores and chain stores and not really available to the direct market, comic market, especially back in the 70s. So they were put only as an experiment, maybe to save the company, I'm guessing. They figured they'd try these, and they put them in the stores. The initial ones didn't sell very well, which would be the August to December 1980 ones. It took about a decade for me to really realize what had happened. I know that I couldn't get them in Winnipeg. I didn't realize it was nationwide, Canada and the United States. So, about a decade later, I had started getting a lot of requests for certain issues, like Uncle Scrooge 179. Everybody wanted to complete a set, needed number 179. There was the Little Lulu, what was it, number 260, I believe. Comics and Stories, I think it was 480. And the one that really bothered everybody was Porky Pig 99. I had, I don't know how many requests for that book. And who would think that people wanted those cartoon comics? The reason they came to me, because I was the guy in the late 70s who decided I was going to carry everything. Everybody else went superhero, superhero, superhero. If you wanted a cartoon comic, you went to Doug Sulipa. If you wanted Archie comic, any of that stuff, they all came to me. So of course, everybody turned to me for these books to complete their sets, and I couldn't find them. Really, even though I bought my personal copies on the stands, it didn't occur to me for a while that was the reason, that it was distributed only that way, and it wasn't just here, it was everywhere. It took till, I think, 2000 or 2002 for me to gather all the information of which issues are scarce. By the way, they repeated, the Whitmans went back to newsstand and direct distribution for 81 and 82, and in 83, 84 they went direct only, sorry, not direct only, I mean pre-pack only, and we couldn't order those either. But in the early 2001-2 era, that's when I started gathering information, and I got it finally listed in the guide that these books were all scarce and had low print runs and were only available in pre-packs. So I started Scrooge 179. I put it on eBay. I had a copy that was, I think, very good. And I put the only copy I had seen on eBay in 5 years. At the time it was true, because I was trying to restock it from my inventory. I put it on eBay, and I think at that time it was listed like $5 in the guide. It went for $510 on eBay.
What year was that?
I believe that was 2001 or 2002. And then I started asking around Winnipeg. I found a second copy. The second copy, I think, was VF or VF Plus. Put that on eBay. That went for $1,200. Then I came up with the Lulu, which I believe is it number 260. It's the expensive one. I put that on eBay, and that was a very good. That went for $710. At the time, it was like $5 in the price guide. So this was a real trend. Then like I say, I broke out all those issues in the price guide, and pretty much all of the August through December 1980 Whitmans are now at about $50 each and up in the guide, and the ones from 83-4, which you can't tell the date on the book, you just have to know. Those ones are pretty much $25 and up each, which is kind of strange for cartoon comics, but they're very highly collected these days. It all goes back to this whole bag experiment.
Do you find that the 1980 bag ones are that much rarer than the 83, 84s?
The August through December 1980 are probably about 4 or 5 times scarcer than the 83-4 ones. So I imagine the initial experiment wasn't very successful, or maybe what might have happened is they might have, maybe some stores would keep them on the stat. See, I think they weren't returnable, so maybe the store wouldn't order the next batch, so the distribution wasn't very good on those books. And they also had the DC Whitmans in that same time period. So the DC Whitmans are probably 10 to 50 times scarcer on average than the regular copies. And they weren't sold in the collector's market, they were sold in the reader's market basically. So most of those copies are destroyed, most of them are low grade. So I got those listed in the price guide, and those have been taking off. One of the recent sales I made was the DC Comics Presents number 22. Until about a year ago it was thought not to exist, and then someone had discovered a copy and even made a film about it. It's on the Comic Mafia on the internet. You can look it up and they'll show you a little film about his discovering the very first copy of that book, that all the completionists figured, they took it off their list, they figured it didn't exist. Then another copy turned up, and I turned up a third one recently. I put it on eBay. It went for, in very good plus, for $402. So.
Does it amaze you that still after 35 years we're still making discoveries of books?
There's so much information out there that is not in the guide, it would blow your mind. I send Overstreet information all the time. Often he won't publish it. Unfortunately, they have restrictions to how many pages they can put in the guide, and I guess a lot of the information I send him takes up too much room, which is sad. I would like to see one day maybe Overstreet could go online. I'm thinking on a Kindle or something perhaps would be great. It would even be better if they would pair Overstreet with, say, Grand Comics database, where you can get all the covers and all the contents information all in one place. That would be fabulous. That's what needs to be done. One of the things I think that we're missing here is the fact that the market has gone mainly for key issues in the last few years, and key issues don't necessarily mean just number ones and origins. It also means good villains, good covers, stuff like that. It would be nice to see books valued based on supply and demand a little more than trying to fit them into averages to conserve space. So why wouldn't a Dr. Octopus issue of Spider-Man in the 70s be worth more than a prison cover issue? You know, that's the kind of thing that sells a book, eh? That's a change I think that needs to be made. It's not going to be made when you're trying to conserve space in a printed book, eh? So that's a direction I think the future is going to see. Hopefully Overstreet does it and not somebody else, but you never know. It's a market that's open for someone who wants to do it.
Quick question about those Whitmans before we move on.
Sure.
Is why do you think the Whitmans, even for the DCs, why did they print a unique cover?
Because, well, they didn't want to be returnable, I think is the biggest thing. And they were aimed at a different market, and they even dropped dates and other things because they didn't want to compete with the other market. So they put them in the bag, and they could sit on the shelf for 6 months. You wouldn't have to return them or worry about them dating. They were distributed by a completely different method, which is, like I said, the coloring book type distribution, where you fill a rack in, say, you know, a Bay store or a, you know, Sears store or whatever, and you throw them on the rack and they could sit there till they sold. You know, if they wanted to, maybe one day if they wanted to get them off the rack, they'd have to clear them out at half price or whatever, but they were pretty much non-returnable and taking up shelf space. So
Let's talk about the Marvel cover price variants.
mm-hmm. Well, let's start with the Whitman one, because that question's been going on since the day it happened. People seem to think there are Whitman variants of Marvel comics. There's a handful. There's a couple of treasuries, there's a magazine, and that's about it. There are no Whitman variants of Marvel standard comics. It was the bag that was Whitman, and people don't seem to get that. I carried the direct editions when they came out. Especially from 77 to 79 confuses people, because they have blank white UPC boxes, they have the diamonds, they have all the things that make them look different. People think that those are Whitman editions. They came in a Whitman bag, but it was a direct copy in a Whitman bag. That's why people think they're Whitman variants. Once it's out of the bag, you cannot tell a difference between a direct and a Whitman copy. The other thing that confuses the matter is that there are reprints. Star Wars, there are reprints. Stuff like Shogun Warriors and a couple other books, there are reprints. That confuses the market too.
Is there an actual difference between printing, say, it's been said Star Wars is reprinted 6 times, but is there a second and a fourth printing, or is it just a continuous reprint of a reprint?
Of the original Marvel, was it 10 issues or so? I think they did some reprints.
I think there's actually, at least the first 18 are available with a white blank box.
Well, some of them say the word reprint right on the cover.
That's true.
Yeah. And then there's the direct editions and the newsstand editions, which really confuses matters. No, there's not a Whitman version. It gets very confusing. But basically, there was several printings of the early ones, and the scarce ones are the reprints, believe it or not. The number one is ultra common. It's gaining demand because, let's face it, it's getting old, and there's a new trilogy of movies coming from Disney. So Star Wars has started to take off again. It had a black cover, so it's hard to get in high grade. So that's making it take off. It's one of the most popular movies and comics of all time. So it has many things going for it. So that's what's making it take off again, and I don't see any reason for it to not keep going that way. The interesting thing is, like you were saying, the price variance. The 35-cent price variant of Star Wars #1 has been legendary since they first got listed in the guide way back around, I don't know, was it 1980 maybe? So it's been listed in the guide for over 30 years, which is why it's so high priced in the guide. My buddy there, John McClure, is the fellow who did the research and got all the 30 to 35 cent Marvel variants listed in the guide. When he first approached them to get them listed, they gave him a hard time. They didn't believe in them. Most of the other dealers didn't believe in them. I guess one of the problems was they couldn't find them, so they didn't really want something they couldn't stock to take off. So there was a lot of resistance against 30 to 35 cent Marvel variants initially. It took about 5 to 10 years to really take off in price, but now they're all bringing multiples of guide in any grade, especially the 35 centers. There was it Marvel Triple Action or something not long ago that went for like $1,000 in 9.4, and just crazy prices for these things. There are some of the westerns, like I think there was a Rawhide Kid or a Two Gun Kid. They went for like $700 or $800 and very good. So these are very high demand books these days. Now there's a lot of people looking for them. But initially this did not take off. There was a lot of resistance. I co-authored the article on Overstreet number 40, I believe, about variants. John called me like about 100 times and sent hundreds of emails. We were researching all these different variants that exist that are not well known or not in the guide yet. You know, the Whitman ones, there's the Canadian variants, there's the Dell variants, there's just endless variants. So I've been selling these things for over a decade, 10, 15, 20 years, some of them. I've been making a lot of money on them. Nobody else seems to pay a lot of attention to them. That's not my problem if they don't want to make money. I did just Dell variants alone and gold key variants alone. There's one main collector. His name is Pat Simpson. He's got probably the world's biggest, most complete Dell and gold key collection. I sold probably at least $10,000 worth of variants to him, and because I searched them out when they were findable, and from my massive stock before everybody else got them, I don't think anybody else is going to be able to touch his collection. He's got them listed online. You could check out what exists. Among other things, at one point in time, the Whitman variants of gold keys from 72 to 80, at one time we figured about 20% of them existed, and then we raised that to about a third, then we raised that to about a half. Now we're thinking 60 or 70%. In the end, it might be most of them exist as Whitman variants. A lot of them are so scarce they never appear in the market because they probably didn't sell well. If they're put in like a dump bin in a store, they might not have had the same print runs for every issue. One issue they might have printed, say, 20,000, another one maybe 5, another one maybe 50. I don't know what the print runs are, I'm just guessing, eh? So I think that might explain why some are so much scarcer than others. And who knows what exists. Pat has been searching down these Whitman variants of gold keys for about a decade. And he's, I think, well beyond the 60% mark. And that's not, believe me, that's a tough set to put together.
How do you feel the influences with the Overstreet price guide year to year, knowing that some of the variants like Star Wars or Iron Fist have been listed, and some of the lesser non-key books haven't been listed? So it's like, same with even Golden Age, where you've seen, because it was simply had attention at an earlier time, it had more time to go up in value, and it's automatically a more expensive book simply because it's been given attention longer.
Yeah, well, that's the problem with the Star Wars. The Star Wars is the most common 35-cent Marvel variant. There are hundreds of copies slabbed. It's been around, everybody's known about it since 1980. That's the only reason it's more valuable. Let's face it, Star Wars for a long time was dead in my bins. The only way for me to sell back issue Star Wars for a long time was to heavily discount them, because I had so many of them. The revival of the second trilogy that came out in the last 10 years or so, that helped Star Wars revive for a while, then it died down again. Now people are getting excited again about the new trilogy, so that's making Star Wars take off again, eh? Star Wars will be around forever. I mean, Star Wars is basically Star Wars is a science fiction comic on film, so it's always going to interest comic collectors.
Where do you see the future for Bronze or any newer book? I suppose, you know, that the print runs are so high that these books can never become scarce.
That's what people seem to think. They thought Bronze Age was not going to take off. It took off. Have you seen the prices for Bronze Age comics? They're too much for a lot of collectors now. That's why the people have resorted to Copper Age. Now Copper Age has taken off. A lot of those are getting pricey. Now people are starting to buy. People are nostalgic for the modern age stuff, basically from, say, about 87 to 95. That stuff is really taking off in demand. In the last year or so, that's been the biggest trend. I've found a lot of people wanting to buy high-grade copies of stuff from that period, because they did not hold up as good as you think they did.
Right.
So I've been slabbing copies. I figure they're the key issues that I can get 9.4 to 8s, and they've actually been selling quite well. The most recent sale I made was X Factor number 6 and 9.8. I got $175 for it, just as an example.
What do you think the future is for mid-grade, for common books?
Mid-grade, you know what? There will always be readers. They sell best in lots or runs. Just like put together, it's almost like a graphic novel. Here's number 1 to 20 of this set. That's the way you're going to sell those books, because there will always be readers of comics. If the entire market collapses, the one thing that's going to remain is people still want to read comics, because people love comics worldwide. The one thing that has changed the most since the internet started is how many overseas customers I have. At one point in time, it was probably 1%. And then it was 5, and then 10. Now it's 10 to 15% of all my sales are overseas. One of the things that's happening that's going overseas, there's a lot of these affordable copies, in other words, low grade. So Dells and Gold Keys and things that aren't that popular over here, they love them overseas. Western comics from Dell, they still sell great overseas. Disney comics sell overseas way better than they sell in North America, for example. They love sets overseas. So I think there's nothing wrong with low-grade comics. In fact, they're some of my best sellers for certain genres, like horror comics, for example. Warren, Eerie and Creepy, for example, or the Dracula Lives, those type of titles. I can't keep them in stock in low grade because everybody wants to read them at affordable prices. So my biggest markup is on the low grade copies because I can't keep them in stock. So I might get, say, 50% over guide for fair to good to GVG copies of those type of titles, because everybody wants to read them. I'm stuck with middle grade, fine, very fine to very fine copies which might sit around for a while, eh?
Do you think, due to having such a massive inventory, that really your success with lower grade books is something that works for you but maybe wouldn't work for 90% of...
That could very well be, because the selection is what makes the difference. The reason I can get a good price for back issue Archies and Harveys is because I have this selection. I mean, not many people could fill in their Betty and Veronica runs, or, you know, Jughead runs or whatever, except at a place like mine, eh? So they will pay me $2 and $3 and $5 and $10 each for ordinary issues. Whereas a store that says say you might have 100 Archie back issues in total compared to my 40,000, might have a hard time getting half guide for them. Selection makes all the difference in the world. In fact, my recommendation if you're a small dealer is to specialize and be really good at what you do. So if you're going to deal only in Marvel, you're going to have all the best Marvels, and if it takes overpaying for them and charging even more, that's what you need to do. My advice is not to compete with everybody else. My advice would be to try to get the stuff the other dealers don't have.
Right.
So you might say, like I've always done well in Charlton comics. Well, people say, well, who collects Charlton comics? I have hundreds of customers who love Charlton comics. How else? People have no idea how popular, for example, Tom Sutton art and Charlton comics are because they don't collect them. My customers, they rave about people like San Ho Kim and Tom Sutton, and even the Ditko issues of the Charlton horror comics, for example. Because I have them, they talk to me about it, they get so excited, they buy more and more and more. They can complete all their runs, eh? Mm-hmm. So, but if you have 100 Charlton comics in total of the 10,000 books they produced, it's not going to do much good to a Charlton collector. Just look at like looking through a flea market box. You're not going to find what you're looking for there. So.
So tell me now, by the mid '80s, kind of what's the direction? How's your business? Where are you located? how's the industry for you?
Well, the turning point was, like, again, when we go back to the direct issues. At that point in time, the direct market basically was slowly taking over and killing the newsstand market, because everything was suddenly being made for collectors. They had to be collectors' items to be interesting, eh? So it was 80s was a period of large quantities of number ones. Everybody was buying big quantities. For example, I ordered, I think, 4,000 copies of Epic Illustrated number one, sold 3,000 of them. Still got 1,000 sitting on my shelf. It's dead in the water. I can't understand it. It's a beautiful book, but I think the books I ordered the most of, I think I ordered 6,000 copies each of Dazzler number one and Spider-Woman number one. I think those were probably the records I had ever sold of a comic. So this is what was happening. People were buying massive quantities for investment, and now those books are too common. What has happened since the CGC age, though, is these books have been neglected because they weren't selling for a long time. Suddenly they're actually scarce and high grade. So how do you make a comic that's common, desirable again, as you collect it only in high grade? So this is why the market has gone that way. That's why CGC has taken off. That way you can be guaranteed you're going to get an actual high grade rather than an overgraded high grade from a seller who doesn't know how to grade. So that's one of the reasons that Marvel prices have taken off, is that you can actually get a high grade and be guaranteed that it's a high grade. So I think that when CGC came along, it really helped the marketplace.
And you think that's going to be good in the long run, like a decade or two down the line?
Well, what I've seen in hobbies like stamps and coins and sports cards, for example, is that the high-end market keeps going up and up and up, and it's endless, because the high-end market people who want investments figure what's the rarest thing is the highest graded copies. So the highest graded copies will probably continue to go up. It's the middle graded copies that are in question.